The Harry Potter series has always been appreciated for its many beloved characters. The list of characters who you wish could just read you a bedtime story is probably longer than in any other series. However, something that caught my attention as I recently reread all the books and rewatched all of the movies were the characters on the other side of the spectrum, the characters we are clearly supposed to despise. I'm specifically referring to the people that will cause others to think that there's something wrong with you if you say that they're your favorite character. The reason why this interests me can be attributed to a quote from the book Story, written by Robert McKee.
Fall in love with all your characters. How can a writer hate his own character? It's his baby. How can he hate what he gave life? Embrace all your creations, especially the bad people. They deserve love like everybody else. No one thinks they're bad. If you can't love them for that, don't write them.
This quote is from a book that many acknowledge as the storytelling Bible. And you may not agree with that, but it's nevertheless a book that has had strong influence on the principles of storytelling. The advice that McKee gives here is almost written as a commandment of storytelling. Love thy characters. When I read his book a couple of years ago, I remember this being one of the passages that resonated with me the most. Therefore, it really arouses my analytical senses when a series as beloved as Harry Potter breaks this principle on so many occasions. In this essay, I will analyze the writing of some of the most infamous characters of the wizarding world. The questions I'm attempting to answer are the following. Number 1. Which are some of the most notable ways in which J.K. Rowling makes her characters unlikable? Number 2. What functions do their negative characterizations serve to the story? And number 3. Would the story be any better if the characters were likable? Ultimately, my goal is to find out whether a writer really should love their characters. Before I begin, I should briefly delimit my analysis. There are several characters that I'm not going to look into. First, I should declare that Snape will not be discussed. My simple reason for this is that he isn't supposed to be hated, at least not all the way through. And this is because Rowling gives him a redemption arc, and his backstory is framed in a way that is clearly supposed to give us empathy for him. It's clear that Snape was loved by his writer, which disqualifies him from the list. The same should be said for a character like Draco Malfoy. At the beginning of the series, he's a one-dimensional rival to Harry Potter, and he's a bully. But towards the end, he has to do things that make us pity him, and it's hard to hate someone that you feel bad for. Again, Rowling clearly doesn't hate him, which disqualifies him from the list. Lastly, I'm not going to include Voldemort in the analysis. He is a villain, but he's also charismatic, smart, and competent. He needs to be likable, otherwise it wouldn't be believable that he's been able to amass such a large following. With that said, let's begin, and we should start at the very beginning with the Dursleys. Interestingly, it's the Dursleys who kick off the series, as the first chapter of the first Harry Potter book was written from the point of view of Mr. Dursley. Throughout the series, Rowling never misses an opportunity to make us hate them, and to that end she mainly uses 4 methods. The first method is quite obvious, namely their abusive behavior towards Harry Potter. The Dursleys constantly neglect Harry's needs, for example by isolating him in a cupboard under the stairs, and later on by locking him up in a room. Many of their measures should be considered violations of his human rights, and could cause severe trauma or other form of mental illness. If you have basic empathy, then it's not surprising that these things can make you dislike the characters. The second way in which Rowling makes the Dursleys unlikable is by making Dudley a spoiled child, who is continuously favorized above Harry. This, I believe, is almost as effective as the previous point. If all Harry's foster parents did was to bully him, we would probably just see them as a couple of sociopaths. But it gets much worse when you contrast the way they treat Harry with the way they treat Dudley. As parents, the Dursleys embody 2 extremes: too much care and way too little. The reason why this is so effective is because it creates an injustice. When we as people see injustices, even in a simple everyday form, it can make us very uncomfortable, sad, or even angry. Now the third method that Rowling uses is a little more unfortunate. To make us dislike the Dursleys, she continuously emphasizes how overweight they are. In other words, Rowling attempts to invoke fat phobia in order to make the audience sympathize less with these characters. In this regard, the series really hasn't aged well. However, the movies are definitely more toned down compared to the books, where it seems almost physically impossible for Rowling to write a scene about the Dursleys without fat jokes or overly detailed descriptions that mock the obesity of Dudley and his father. And there is already a video by the YouTuber OK to be Fat that summarizes the dehumanizing ways in which the Dursleys are portrayed. I recommend watching it if you are interested in this topic.
Dudley is described as having a fat head, fat wrists, fat arms, and fat legs. We are also treated to multiple mentions of Dudley having a big fat butt, because that's certainly an appropriate way for an adult to describe a fictional child. We also get other characters who have fat thumbs, fat fingers, fat cheeks, or as an immensely fat melting iced cake. And Joanne frequently likes to mention fat people having multiple chins, so that's nice. Fat people never just do things in the Harry Potter books. Fat people don't walk anywhere. They waddle or lumber or have a heavy tread. Fat people fat their way down the street fatly while fatting around. And if you think I'm kidding, there's a description of Dolores Umbridge where she literally turns squatly.
Rowling uses physical descriptions as a way of making her characters less likable. Lastly, let's talk about the most interesting reason why these characters are so poorly portrayed, namely their motifs of conformism. One of the most distinguished traits of the Dursleys are how much they hate everything that is out of the ordinary. Rowling writes,
Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense.
What needs to be emphasized is that the themes of conformism are not by chance. The fact that the Dursleys are abusive, middle class, and live in a suburban townhouse, obsessed with being normal, these are all deliberate choices to make us despise the characters. Now it's time to discuss the next question. What function does the unlikability of the Dursleys serve to the story? The overall function of the characterization of the Dursleys is quite clear. The famous story model, known as the hero's journey, developed by Joe Campbell, was possibly used by J.K. Rowling to structure up her story. If we look at the model, we can clearly see how the Dursleys are a characterization of what's called the normal world. According to Campbell, the hero needs to be in conflict with the normal world, otherwise there would be no good reason for him to leave everything behind. They need to be as awful as possible so that Harry's transition to the magical world can feel as wonderful as possible. After seeing that Harry has been locked up, and he's been neglected and bullied, we know that he'll feel liberated, included, and embraced when he gets to his new magical home. One of my favorite scenes from the first movie, and also from the entire series, is the one where Harry has just arrived at Hogwarts. He sits in his new bedroom in pajamas and looks out the window. We can only imagine what emotions and thoughts are bubbling inside him. Maybe he feels that his life is finally about to start. Had Harry been brought up in a normal home with a loving family, this scene would not hit the same notes. What should also be mentioned is that the Dursleys cause somewhat of a departure from standard story structure. Normally in the hero's journey, the protagonist gets a call to action but refuses it. And then after an inciting incident in the normal world, they finally choose to embark on their journey. Harry Potter, though, never hesitates about going out on his adventure. it's just the Dursleys who keep him at home against his will until Hagrid comes to get him. Harry's not a very active protagonist, and this is a recurring element throughout the series. There's often other characters who tell him what to do or give him the things that he needs. The fact that the Dursleys initially keep Harry from going out on his journey is not necessarily a bad thing though. Harry being isolated at the beginning is, as I said, what makes his arrival at Hogwarts feel even more like a liberating contrast. This is such an effective formula for the first act that J.K. Rowling chooses to have most of the book start with Harry at the Dursleys. Harry is kept at home, but manages to escape. Already we can distinguish one of the key functions of unlikable characters in the Harry Potter series, namely tension and release. The Dursleys exist to create conflict at the beginning of the story. The more the conflict builds, the better it feels when it's eventually resolved. The release of tension can be done in many ways. One is what we could call karma or divine retribution, where bad actions lead to bad consequences or punishment. Since we don't empathize with these characters, the writer can hurt them in whatever way she likes. Rowling often chooses to do this in a rather poetic way, and, rather unfortunately again, in the case of the Dursleys, their punishment is tied to the fatphobic themes of their characterization. It's not a coincidence that Dudley gets a pigtail, nor is it a coincidence that Aunt Marge is blown up like a balloon. If something similar were done to a character like Hagrid or Mrs. Weasley, we would feel very uncomfortable. But now we laugh. There's a Swedish saying that goes "Skadeglädje är den enda sanna glädjen." This brings me to the third and final function that us hating the characters serves to the story. Humor. Not only is it funny when unlikable characters get what they deserve, but in general they are just funny people. Some of the funniest scenes in the movies involve the Dursleys, in my opinion.
Up! Get up! Now! Wake up, cousin! We're going to the zoo!
As we can see, these people are exaggerated, sometimes to an absurd degree, and hyperbole is an age-old way of producing humor. The humor isn't actually found in the hyperbole itself, but in the fact that the gap between the exaggeration and real life isn't always that big. In other words, there is some truth to the things that she chooses to exaggerate. Now that we learned so much about the Dursleys, we should discuss whether the story would be any better had the Dursleys been more likable. Before we do so, however, I should mention that the characters already have something resembling a redemption arc. At least Dudley, and to some extent Petunia.
I don't think you're a waste of space.
Thanks.
I have lived in this house for 20 years. And now in a single night, I'm expected to leave.
They'll torture you. If they think for a moment you know where I'm going, they'll stop at nothing.
Do you think I don't know what they're capable of? You didn't just lose a mother that night in Godric's Hollow, you know. I lost a sister.
To be honest, we shouldn't count these small acts of empathy as redemption arcs. Even though Dudley shows Harry some gratitude and is maybe a little sorry for bullying him throughout his entire childhood, I highly doubt that anyone changes their opinion about this awful family just for that one scene. What I want to know is, What if they, from the very start, were written in a more nuanced way? Because of its hypothetical nature, however, I'm not going to dwell on this question too much. The best argument for making the Dursleys unlikable is, in my opinion, how it elevates Harry's transition from the normal world to the magical. Of course, the story could work without us hating the Muggle family. In fact, it would probably make for a more complicated and interesting story, where Harry has an actual dilemma about leaving the normal world. Harry, as a protagonist, would feel more like an agent of his own life. As a result, maybe it would also be easier to relate to him as a character. What's clear is that both paths come with pros and cons, and ultimately the quality lies in the execution. Hopefully, this analysis has provided some knowledge and some wisdom about what constitutes unlikable characters and why they exist. Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets is my favorite of the Harry Potter books and my second favorite among the movies. According to me, Chamber of Secrets represents a phase of Rowling's writing where she was able to write a strong and condensed story while still effectively providing much in the ways of atmosphere, world building and character. The story is wrapped around a clear mystery in which Harry, Ron and Hermione are actively working to solve the puzzle. Now, interestingly, this is not consensus among the fans. On most lists, Chambers is ranked as the worst or second worst in the series, and this applies to both the movie and the novel. In my mind, I've to some degree always attributed this reception to one single character, namely Gilderoy Lockhart. This defense against the dark arts teacher has to me always felt needlessly one-dimensional, making the story miss some of its potential. In this analysis, I'll challenge this view. Why is Lockhart characterized in the way that he is? And is it serving or obstructing the story that J.K. Rowling wants to tell? Now, first it should be said that Lockhart isn't as despicable as the Dursleys. He's unlikable in a significantly more innocent way. Unlike the Dursleys, or even a character like Snape for that matter, he doesn't bully children, and before the reveal at the end, he's portrayed as a relatively harmless goofball. He's awful in many ways, but some people think he's so funny that it's hard not to like him. The main reason why Lockhart even qualifies for this video is this quote from Rowling.
Other people have contributed to the odd characteristic, such as a nose, to a character, but the only character who I sat down and thought that I would base on someone is Gilderoy Lockhart. Maybe he's not the one that you would think of, but I have to say that the living model was worse. It made up for having to endure him for 2 solid years.
It's quite obvious that Rowling didn't write Lockhart out of love, but as a means of revenge or catharsis. Therefore, we can establish that Lockhart, just like the Dursleys, is clearly intended to be disliked by the readers. To this aim, Rowling primarily uses 3 methods. Firstly, and most clearly, is the way Lockhart's personality is written. He's constructed as a shallow, self-absorbed person, and he's given no traits whatsoever to nuance this portrayal. This characterization is also reflected in his physical appearance, most notably in his wavy hair and his smarmy smile. To contrast Lockhart's self-image, Rowling gives him a glaring incompetence. Aside from his ability to wipe the memories of his victims in order to steal their heroic acts, Lockhart fails miserably at everything he attempts to do. It doesn't matter if it's dueling or teaching his subject or healing a wounded student. He does not succeed. Lockhart is famous. The only way a self-absorbed good-for-nothing can become truly excruciating is if they're also famous. A lot of us seem to believe that we live in a meritocracy where fame and fortune is given to those who deserve it, at least to some degree. Therefore, whenever we find a case where this clearly isn't the case, it can make us upset. Not only is Lockhart famous, he's also idolized by many of the women in the series. not only by women in his own age, like Mrs. Weasley, but also by the girls in Harry's class, even including Hermione for some reason. Those are the three main ingredients of Lockhart. Now let's discuss the more interesting question of how this affects the story. Once again, a key function is the tension and release that Lockhart's narcissism creates. Just as with the Dursleys, karma is a key factor to why this man is written the way he is. Every time he's annoying and every time he's unjustly praised by the ladies in the cast, tension builds. And every time he fails, the tension is released a little bit, which eventually culminates when he gets his own memory wiped. His punishment is therefore also a poetic one, just as with the Dursleys. Since he's been trying to create a legacy around himself using memory charms, it's only fitting that his own magic is reflected back on him. As with the Dursleys, humor is also a welcomed byproduct of character unlikability. When you create a hyperbolic character, you get more opportunities for jokes, without having to worry about harming our empathy for them. For example, Lockhart has a painting of himself painting a self-portrait of himself. He also hands out quizzes that are just about himself and his achievements. These things are genuinely funny and would not have the same effect if Lockhart was more toned down as a character. So, Lockhart is an exaggerated comic relief character, and he's basically a Scooby-Doo villain. But because of his constant incompetence, the reveal that he's a fraud is in no way surprising. In fact, it would have been more surprising if it turned out that he actually had done all of the things that he's written about in his books. Beyond the tension and release and the humor, it's not very clear what purpose he serves for the story and the overarching mystery concerning the Chamber of Secrets. He does have something in common with Harry, namely that they're both famous, but Harry doesn't care about being famous, and thus Lockhart doesn't really contribute anything to his character arc. If Harry had a toss of illusion of grandeur, maybe as a result of defeating Voldemort at the end of the previous year, then Lockhart would play an important role for his character. But Harry has no such traits, and Lockhart's characterization has no thematic implications. Now finally we've arrived at the most interesting question. Would the story benefit from making Lockhart more likable? If we don't want to change too much in terms of his personality, simply removing his incompetence would probably be the best way of making him more nuanced and thus more likable. On the surface, this may seem like a big change, as almost every scene with him would have to be rewritten. For example, he would be the winner in the duel between him and Snape, and the scene where Harry gets his bones removed would also have to be rewritten some way. Most importantly, the reveal at the end about him wiping the memories of witches and wizards to steal their success would have to be removed. Instead, what if Lockhart didn't lie when he said that he knew the location of the Chambers of Secrets? What if instead of trying to flee the castle, Lockhart actually tried to get down there on his own? And when he finds Ron and Harry there, he tries to stop them, because he wants the glory by himself. It's already established that Ron has acquired a new wand, perhaps bought to him by Harry, because Harry has money, and he is the one who defeats Lockhart. It's a satisfying moment, since this way Ron is given agency after an entire book/movie of not being able to do anything. What's most interesting about this change of Lockhart's character is how counterintuitive it is. We want to dislike the guy, but in the new version, his self-admiration would no longer be a form of narcissism or illusion of grandeur. It would just be a form of confidence. A reason why this change might feel wrong is because a part of us wants to see self-absorbed people be revealed as frauds. We want karma. Going against instincts like these is often what's required for writing nuanced characters. Besides giving the character more depth, the rewrite also has some clear benefits to the story. Lockhart potentially could work as a decoy in the mystery surrounding the Chambers of Secrets. When Malfoy admits to not being the heir of Slytherin, Harry and the reader could start suspecting Lockhart. Now, he is after all clearly powerful enough to be sus. As a conclusion, making Lockhart more likable by making him more competent is an interesting idea. In comparison to the Dursleys, where the pros and cons of such a new characterization were harder to decide, the case of Lockhart feels significantly less like a dilemma. With his current characterization, he is funny, iconic, and basically functions as a punching bag. It's not bad, but removing his incompetence would add much needed depth to the scenes featuring him, which after all are quite many. Maybe you personally prefer his current state as a Scooby-Doo villain, and that would be fine. Hopefully this discussion can at least help us pinpoint why we feel the way we do when we watch or read the second installment of Harry Potter.
It might provoke them!
It would probably be considered a crime to make an analysis of the unlikable characters of the wizarding world without discussing Umbridge. She's the pink elephant in the room. She's probably the most despised fictional character of all time. She needs no introduction, so let's address the first question. What makes her so unbearable? Similarly to Lockhart, her personality is a key component of her unlikability. No aspect of her character can be considered charming or pleasant. Her girly, sugary aura is a pathetic attempt to hide her hateful ideology, and in that sense she's like a cupcake filled with feces. Moreover, she's in a constant state of passive aggression. As with the Dursleys, even her physical traits are used to amplify her traits. She wears pink and has a pink office filled with pictures of kittens. It's clear that the color pink is chosen as a way of creating an ugly contrast. It's a color that we associate with love, compassion, and innocence, but Umbridge is, of course, the opposite of all that. In the books, Rowling's physical descriptions are even more dehumanizing. Her face is toad-like, and she's so short that you can't even tell if she's sitting or standing, and she's also described as fat. With Lockhart, Rowling uses attractiveness to make a character unlikable. Here, she uses ugliness to the same effect. Besides her not-so-charming character, Umbridge is also abusive, and this point speaks for itself. She's an evil witch using her power to physically hurt students, and even uses torture, seemingly deriving pleasure from repression and punishment. What makes her awful isn't just how she behaves or what she does, but what she represents. When Umbridge arrives at Hogwarts, the readers have already read 4 books and probably view Hogwarts as a second home. Everyone can imagine getting the Hogwarts letter in the mail, going on the train, and getting sorted into a house, going to classes, learning spells, and making friends. Then, all of a sudden, in comes this bureaucrat who removes your wands and takes all the fun and magic away from Hogwarts. She's an embodiment of the corruption in society, where a deluded government is desperately trying to save its own skin by lies and repression. We all have experiences of bad teachers, bad principals, and bad politicians. Umbridge is like a combination of all of these things on steroids. So, that was a lot of things, but it was still a very condensed summary of what makes Umbridge so repulsive. In truth, there are probably hundreds of more things that make her easy to hate, even very small things like the way she clears her throat.
Has asked me to remind you.
What really does the trick is the combination of a passive-aggressive behavior, a performative sweetness, bureaucracy, bad teaching, abuse, and her hunger for power. Despite Umbridge's fixation with the rules, she has nothing against breaking them if it benefits herself, like when she wants to use an illegal curse to torture Harry Potter. If there's something that we as a society collectively hate, it's probably hypocrites. What's most interesting about Umbridge's unlikability, though, is the question of why she's constructed the way she is. And to answer this, we have to look at the function of Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. It's the 5th book in the series, and in the previous book, Voldemort returns in a physical form, So the 5th installment is about a wizarding world struggling to accept this truth. For the majority of the book, the Ministry acts as an antagonistic force, doing everything in its power to keep society in the shadows. With this in mind, it's clear that the unlikability of Umbridge serves many functions. Let's start by looking back at the key function of the characters that we've previously examined, and the first one being the humor that comes with having such an exaggerated character. And without a doubt, we can see that humor is an important aspect of why Umbridge is constructed in the way that she is.
You applied first for the Defense Against the Dark Arts post, is that correct?
Yes.
But you were unsuccessful?
Obviously.
With the Dursleys and Lockhart, tension and release were important effects of creating the characters the way that they were created, and we can see that this also applies to Umbridge's characterization. The more that we hate the character, the more satisfying it gets when she eventually loses. If we view Umbridge as a monster, the writers can do practically whatever they want with her, without us feeling empathy. And what happens to Umbridge at the end of Harry Potter is actually pretty brutal.
Do something! Tell them I mean no harm!
I'm sorry, Professor. I must not tell lies.
What are you doing? I am Senior Undersecretary to Law.
So we can see that Rowling punishes this character, which is intended to be satisfying. And this is not even her final punishment. After the defeat of Voldemort, she was, according to the wiki, sentenced to Azkaban for her crimes against Muggleborns, where she would remain for the rest of her life. Looking at the story, we can see that the characterization of Umbridge, more than anything, is a way to make you dislike the Ministry. Umbridge is one of the tentacles of the Ministry, showing how far the state is willing to go to deny the fact of Voldemort returning to life. Arguably, the best reason for making Umbridge as despicable as possible is the corruption is not supposed to be a pleasant experience. It could even be argued that the things that Umbridge has to do in order to contain the truth, like implementing hundreds of rules, firing teachers, and prohibiting the use of magic, are things that would make any person unlikable. And this smoothly leads us to the final question, the one I've been looking forward to since the very beginning of this video. How would it affect the story if Umbridge were likable? Is it even possible to make her likable? To answer this question, we should take a look at a character from a different piece of fiction that plays a similar role. In the 3rd season of the Netflix original TV series Sex Education, Hope Haddon is introduced as the new headmistress of Moordale Secondary School. According to her, her task is to clean up the school's reputation as sex school. Eventually, Haddon turns to controversial methods, such as promoting sexual abstinence, enforcing punishments, publicly shaming students, and refusing to acknowledge non-binary students. What's interesting, however, is the deviating approach that the writers use for a character that, on paper, should be somewhat similar to Umbridge. Let's illuminate this by looking at how each character introduces themselves.
She was at my hearing. She works for Fudge.
Thank you, Headmaster, for those kind words of welcome. And how lovely to see all your bright, happy faces smiling up at me. I'm sure we're all going to be very good friends.
That's likely.
The Ministry of Magic has always considered the education of young witches and wizards to be of vital importance. Although each headmaster has brought something new to this historic school, progress for the sake of progress must be discouraged. Let us preserve what must be preserved, perfect what can be perfected, and prune practices that ought to be prohibited.
Thank you, Professor Umbridge. That really was most illuminating.
Morning, Moordale. How's everyone feeling today?
Really good!
I am your new head teacher, Mrs. Haddon. But you can call me Hope.
She's cool. Teachers aren't supposed to be cool.
The first thing you need to know about me is that I used to be sitting where you are now. Literally. Yeah, I went to Moordale too.
I love her lipstick. So bold.
I've achieved a lot since then. 2 degrees, teaching positions at some of the country's top institutions, and by 28, I became the youngest head teacher in the UK. But the years I spent in this building were the best of my life. This school not only encouraged me to excel academically, but it truly allowed me to find my purpose. Which is why it's been so hurtful to read some of the horrible things written about Moordale in the press. I don't know what went wrong or how we ended up here, but I do know it changes today. And I can promise you this: if you work hard and you take pride in your school, I will get Moordale and your futures back on track.
Now, personality-wise, these two characters are very different from each other. The most important difference being their level of charisma. Simply judging from these two scenes, it's clear that Umbridge fails to gain the trust of her students. Her speech sounds rehearsed, her empathy feels fake, and most importantly, she fails to connect with the audience and convince them that she is here for the best of the school. From her rather short introduction, it becomes obvious to everyone that Umbridge was not appointed by Dumbledore. Haddon, on the other hand, completely wins the trusts of her students. Later on, she becomes less popular as the students are subjected to more and more of her reactionary policies, but she continues to be portrayed as well-spoken and smart. The difference between Umbridge and Haddon is the difference between a one-dimensional villain and a nuanced villain. There are many ways to make a character nuanced, but perhaps the most effective has to do with contradictions. Haddon is constructed with a combination of positive and negative traits, while Umbridge is a deadly cocktail of basically only negative ones. Another factor that makes Haddon a significantly more nuanced character is the fact that we're given an explanation for her actions. Eventually, and this is a bit of a spoiler, it's revealed that her manipulative and abusive leadership is a consequence of her not being able to have a baby. This move by the writers is clearly designed to make the audience have more sympathy for her as a person. In my opinion, though, this is quite cliché as far as character motivations go. She's basically twirling her mustache and saying, if I can't have babies, then no one should be allowed to have sex. But the intention of the writers was to humanize her, and on some level, I think we all can understand that people do bad things as a result of stress, anxiety, or trauma. Just as with Snape in Harry Potter, showing the reason why someone is bad may not fully redeem the character, but at least it makes them more human, and thus a little harder to dislike. Umbridge, on the other hand, is given no psychological explanation to her evils, as we're told nothing about her personal life or her background. All that we get to know is that she hates children and she loves order, and which is why she lets the ends justify the means. All of these things are told to us through her own dialogue at the end of Harry Potter 5, but we're never shown what events caused her to adopt this ideology. I'm also going to add that I'm glad that I didn't do this. Umbridge is not worth redeeming. It would be very forced no matter how skilled a writer you were. Through the parallel to sex education, we can see that it's fully possible to make a somewhat likable character who has a similar function and motivation as Umbridge. However, Umbridge has such a hyperbolic personality, clearly intended to make us hate her as much as possible. So if we would ever want, for whatever reason, to make her more nuanced or likable, she would have to be more or less completely rewritten. The result of such an endeavor would probably be a completely different story. Something I didn't explicitly mention when I discussed the purpose of Umbridge earlier was that making us hate her contributes to showing that it's not just the Death Eaters that are capable of evil. Evil isn't just a logical extension of hating muggles. It can be more than that, like letting the ends justify the means, prioritizing order above everything else. Having Umbridge do bad things is a way of demonstrating that the wizarding world is nuanced. The question is, however, if this nuance not would have been better communicated if Umbridge had a charismatic personality to contrast her deeds. In my opinion, the question and the discussion it creates is more important than the answer. At the beginning of this essay, I referred to an advice from Robert McKee, who proposed that writers should love their characters. As a way of testing this theory, I examined 3 infamous characters from the Harry Potter franchise. And what have we learned from this analysis? Well, the most important takeaway seems to be that McKee should perhaps consider nuancing his advice, which in my opinion could be said about very many of the things that these so-called story gurus proclaim as rules. The act of creating a character out of hatred seems to have both pros and cons. The most important benefit of this is probably humor. The reason why these characters are funny are because they stem from an age-old technique that we know as caricature. For a character to be truly awful, they can't just be bad. They have to represent something deeper in our culture. The Dursleys are a caricature of middle-class conformism. Lockhart is a caricature of famous or rich people. Umbridge is a caricature of a lot of things, like a bad teacher, a filthy politician, a bureaucrat. She embodies everything that is wrong, not only with the school system, but maybe also with government. The characters that Rowling wrote out of despise clearly add to the charm of the universe, but at times this happens at expense of emotional depth. Nuanced characters aren't by definition better than one-dimensional ones. If we were to rewrite these 3 characters, it would not necessarily result in anything better than what's currently there. Hopefully, we've at least seen that the way you characterize people in fiction can have strong effects on the way that the readers experience the world that you create. Thank you for watching this video.